The following compilation features unsettling and spine-chilling tales sourced from Reddit's horror communities. Reader discretion is strongly advised. These narratives may contain graphic descriptions, psychological distress, and themes that could unsettle sensitive individuals. Proceed with caution, as immersion into these eerie stories may provoke fear, unease, and sleep disturbances. Enter this realm of Reddit's creepy horror stories at your own risk, as the line between reality and the macabre may blur within these chilling narratives. Marcus Teller wasn't a billionaire when I dated him. This was back in the early 2010s, when his startup was just entering the first stages of success. He had money and a bit of fame, but he hadn't been on the cover of Fortune yet. I wasn't exactly starstruck. At the time, we ran in the same social circle of recent Ivy grads trying to make it in New York. I was no model, but I was pretty in a bookish way that attracted plenty of attention from young men like him. So I wasn't surprised when he cornered me at a mutual friend's party and talked at me until I'd texted him my number. Marcus was tall, pudgy even back then in his early 20s, full of confidence and bluster that seemed to mask a deep insecurity. Within 5 minutes of talking with me, he'd mentioned that his sister had clerked for a Supreme Court justice and that his father had 10 senators' cell numbers in his phone. He left a few messages over the next week, proposing coffee, drinks, even inviting me to an office party as his +1. I politely declined each invitation, citing a busy work schedule at the publishing house where I interned, which wasn't entirely false. For a few weeks, his messages stopped. I found myself regretting the way I'd dismissed him. He was good-looking enough, clearly bright. You could already tell he'd be someone important, even if he was aggressive. When my phone beeped early one Saturday morning, I was a bit surprised. Marcus, been over in Davos for a bit. Mind-blowing conversations. Anyway, back now, and I used some connections to get a reservation at Mickey's tonight at 7. I'm sure you've heard of it. My treat. Of course I'd heard of Mickey's. It wasn't a restaurant. Exactly. The people who ran it called it an ephemeral culinary event space. It showed up for a night at a time in various spots around the city. Reservations could only be had for people in the know, and it cost 5 figures just to get in the door. The menu was prix fixe, wine included with each course. I held the text up for my roommate, Raina, to read. Holy fuck, Cassie. Do it. I shouldn't have been surprised at her reaction. She'd once dated a guy mostly because he was an engineer at Ticketmaster and could get us free concert tickets. If I go, he's going to have certain expectations, I said, waffling in my own mind. I wasn't repulsed or attracted by Marcus. Not yet, at least. I didn't know quite how to feel about him. Guys will get expectations because they bought you Taco Bell. This is Mickey's. I say, do it, and then Uber home if he acts like a dick. Or maybe you'll actually end up liking him. Could be a cool story to tell the grandkids. Right. I tried to remember all of the rumors I'd heard about Mickey's. One girl claimed a friend of a friend had seen them kill and butcher a live cow in the middle of the event space before serving steak tartare. Another said she'd been served a bottle of wine recovered from a sunken Spanish galleon. I texted back. Me, 7th works. What should I wear? Marcus, anything. My Mickey's experience started around sunset. At first, I was sure Marcus had texted me the wrong address. It was a ferry dock I'd never heard of before, way over by Hunts Point. It was dark and getting misty. Somewhere, a foghorn blew. I almost told my Uber driver to take me home. Then I spotted a crowd of people gathered by a dock down the street. It was an eclectic mix, plenty of guys in suits, fresh off a day grinding in out in the financial district. Some girls dressed in insane over-the-top stuff, like it was the Met Gala. Then there were others in more hipstery-type clothes, expensive tight jeans, cut-up Armani Exchange t-shirts. I figured I'd found the right place. As I approached the crowd, Marcus ran up to me. It couldn't have been more than half a block of jogging, but he was still slightly breathless from the effort. Wow, he said. Wow. I looked down. Since he'd offered no instructions, I'd gone with a little black dress I'd plucked off the rack at Nordstrom's for a few formal events my senior year of college, and accessorized with a bit of silver jewelry and matching flats. "Thanks," I said, still waffling between flattered and icked out. Marcus was dressed in a white button-down shirt with a blue blazer and khakis, as if it were still summer. It wasn't totally out of place, but it betrayed a certain obliviousness. Maybe that was part of his charm. He offered me his arm and I took it. We walked back toward the crowd, a subtle blend of expensive colognes and perfumes wafting around us as we joined them. Then, almost out of nowhere, a ferry appeared through the mist. It might have been any normal boat, except that it had almost no lights on, like its operators were intentionally trying to stay hidden. In little time at all, the ferry had docked. A few men in tuxedos helped rope the ferry to the dock and then laid down a metal ramp. They didn't say a word, but the whole thing put me a little ill at ease. It took them a few tries to get the ropes right, in a way that made me think they hadn't done this many times before. Finally, we boarded, Marcus carefully holding onto me as we ascended the ramp to make sure I didn't take a spill into the East River. We stayed connected as we ascended a flight of rusty stairs, up to the main deck. Then Marcus reached forward, opening a rust-rimmed door that led to an enclosed sitting area. Suddenly, it was like we had stepped onto fucking Mars. Black cloth wrapped every wall and window. All around, tropical plants, uplit at bizarre angles, made the place feel like a jungle. Outside, the fall air had been crisp, almost cold. Here, it was muggy. Suddenly, all at once, boxes shaped like treasure chests opened, and a throng of butterflies emerged, fluttering all around us. For a moment, I sat enchanted, realizing that each chest had held a different color. Orange monarchs, yellow swallowtails, radiant blue odontises. A red lacewing alighted on my shoulder, and I couldn't help but smile. It delicately folded and unfolded its wings, tickling my bare skin. And then, suddenly, Marcus plucked it off my shoulder and popped it into his mouth. It took everything I had in me not to scream. "Marcus," I said, "what are you—" As I said the word, I looked around the room and realized he wasn't the only one eating. As I watched in disgust, I saw a girl in a white dress caked in Swarovski crystals pluck a green butterfly from her hair and pop it into her mouth, smiling and chewing, then opening her mouth so her date could see she'd swallowed the whole thing. Everyone was eating, everyone but me. "Is there a color I can get for you?" asked Marcus. "Maybe that lavender one?"
Nah.
"That's a purple emperor," I said softly. I'd spent several weeks in the loft of our house one summer, leafing through a book about butterflies while my parents argued downstairs. I tried to remember if it was safe to eat. Yes, I thought. Purple emperors were technically non-toxic. Marcus grabbed the butterfly, carelessly crushing its wings as he handed it to me. "I like the blue ones best," he said. "You have this one." I looked around and realized that one of the men in the tuxedos was watching us. His eyes were cold. A few other guests were watching too, waiting to see what I'd do. "Come on," said Marcus. "You're not picky." "Right. This is starting to get kind of embarrassing." Carefully, I took the butterfly from his hand. Its little body was shaking slightly, its tiny legs scrabbling in the air. It was in pain, I told myself. It was a mercy. I popped it into my mouth, crushing it against the roof of my mouth with my tongue. I didn't stop until I felt it stop moving. Then, finally, I relaxed my tongue. It tasted like nothing I'd ever had before. A kind of organic, soil-like umami somewhere between dirt and seaweed. "Good." "Right," said Marcus, beaming. "Way better with champagne, though kind of dries out your mouth." "Right." I nodded weakly, realizing I was trying not to cry. A waiter came by with a tray of long-stemmed flutes, and the other guests accepted them in turn, no longer paying attention to me. Marcus took 2 glasses and handed me one. "What is it?" he asked the waiter. The man didn't reply, but gestured to a small white card on the tray, reading 1943 Paul Roger, London, England. sparkling white from the private collection of Winston Churchill. Marcus took a sip and gestured that I should do the same. "Not bad," he said after a second. "I thought it would be more bubbly. Maybe it loses some of the carbonation when it gets old like this." A piece of the butterfly was stuck in my teeth. I could feel it lodged there. Frantically, I tried to work it out with my tongue. Then, finally, I took a swig of the ancient wine. It was flat and a bit too warm, with a vague undercurrent of vinegar. I swished it around in my mouth, working the piece of butterfly free before finally swallowing. "Good," I said, nodding at Marcus, "but I'd better pace myself." I tried to hand him the glass, but he took a step back, like I'd tried to burn him. "Careful," he said. "Every element of this dinner has been meticulously planned. They really won't like it if you waste food or drinks. That wine in your hand costs over $5,000 a bottle, and it's yours, no one else's." I looked around and realized a few waiters were watching me now. I took another sip. If anything, it tasted ever more strongly of warm vinegar now. As I lowered my glass, the men's eyes never left me. Suddenly, I wanted nothing more than to run out of the too-hot room. I looked toward the door and saw two men as big as rhinos, also in tuxedos, standing in front of it. "I need to get off," I whispered to Marcus. "And what? Swim back to Hunts Point?" "Nah." Something dropped in my stomach. When had we left the dock? I walked over to the doorway, looking past the men, and saw that what Marcus said was true. We were a long way from shore now, far enough that the city lights twinkled in the distance. One of the men cleared his throat and adjusted a bit of black fabric behind him, eliminating the city view. "You should go find your seats," he said meaningfully. "The soup course is about to start." "Nah." I was about to say something when Marcus took my arm, pulling me toward one of the able a bit too forcefully. "Hey," I said, "you're hurting me." "I'm helping you," he said. "Helping me what?" "Nah." "Maybe not embarrass yourself. Maybe not disappear into the Atlantic Ocean at night." "Nah." I looked back at the large men by the door. They were watching me intently. I imagined how easily they might pick me up and toss me into the cold black water. I couldn't have weighed more than 100 pounds. I barely ate back then. I hadn't gone swimming since high school. I was bony and tended to sink in my parents' slightly green backyard pool. Dark thoughts bit at me like sharp-toothed fish, the same kind that would eat my corpse if I did the wrong thing at this dinner. "Soup?" asked Marcus, attempting a reassuring smile. It was something he would never master. Years later, as his company was going down in flames, multiple investigations ongoing into a massive fraud, I would see him try that same false smile on CNN. No one would believe it then either. We sat today at a banquet table draped in a tablecloth of fresh leather. I had never seen such a thing before. The other guests were running their hands along it, whispering about the quality, wondering aloud if it was cowskin or some other synthetic material. My bowl was a shell, gleaming with a pearlescent sheen. Inside, it was half full with steaming, brown liquid containing a pyramidal stack of cubed meat. A spoon of carved wood Saturday beside it. Suddenly, a voice boomed through loudspeakers, invoking the French words "cuisse humaine" in a low monotone. "What's that mean?" I asked. I'd taken Spanish all through school, a more useful language. Marcus shrugged. "I'm trying to learn some Mandarin on Duolingo. French is practically a dead language anyway." It seemed like an asinine thing to say, but he spoke the words with such authority that I couldn't help but nod. Around me, several women tittered before reaching forward with their spoons to take their first bites. Marcus did the same, closing his eyes in pleasure as his lips closed around the meat. His mouth was suddenly horrifying to me. I was sure he'd try to kiss me later. Kiss me or worse. I hoped he'd take my no gracefully, but feared he wouldn't. "It's amazing," he said. "It's like beef turned into sex." He nodded at a cluster of nearby waiters, and I realized they were watching me intently, watching and whispering. "Eat," Marcus whispered, his tone no longer friendly. I reached forward with my spoon and took a cube of meat. It glistened like a topaz in front of me. I couldn't deny how good it smelled. like the scent of ham filling the house on Christmas morning at my grandfather's house. And yet my lips wouldn't open. The meat trembled on my spoon. The deadly men watched. Marcus watched. I felt naked, burned by too many eyes. Down the table, a girl had already finished her meat and had picked up her shell. Trying to drink the broth, it slipped out the sides and splashed onto her chest, ruining a dress that cost more than my father's salary. She and her friends laughed hard. "Eat," commanded Marcus again, and I relented. I opened my mouth and let the meat inside. There, it Saturday on my tongue, slowly melting like butter. It was the best thing I'd ever tasted, or would ever taste again. Marcus smiled. "Told you," he said. Then, raising a hand, he shouted for red wine. Many hours and many courses followed. There were noodles shaped like stars supporting a glistening sphere of meat that melted at the touch, revealing a buttery center. 2 different steaks followed, the meat tender as belly fat. At one point, we were served a tree of bread, all hung with cured meats, hanging from its branches like ornaments. Wines accompanied each course. They were vintages owned by famous men and varieties that had gone extinct decades ago. One may have been from Constantinople in the time of the Byzantine Empire, though that seems impossible in retrospect. By the time the final dish came out, I was full to bursting, my head swimming with drink. By then, Marcus's hand was lying in my lap, his hand kneading my thigh in a way I'd decided was pleasing. All of the fear and anxiety that had welled up at me in the early stages of the night was gone, replaced with a kind of bliss I would never experience again. I felt like I had come out of a dark cave after years of eating nothing but stale bread, only to find a vibrant forest of glistening fruits. My senses were on fire. I wanted to lick everything, the plates, the tablecloth, maybe even Marcus. The voice, it may have been God's voice as far as I was concerned, boomed from the speakers, "Ortez sur un lit de laitue." Carefully, the waiters laid down plates covered in silver domes, something I'd only seen in cartoons. Then, all at once, they lifted the domes with a flourish. All around me, peals of laughter filled the room. As for me, it took everything I had not to scream. There, sitting in front of me, sat a human toe on top of a bed of lettuce. The toe was entirely intact, though dark with sauce and sprinkled with pepper and herbs. Still, it was whole enough that one could easily imagine it wiggling to life if reattached to a foot. All at once, the fear flooded back to me. My stomach turned. I wondered what punishments might befall me if I threw up. I imagined myself roped to a glistening steel table, screaming as a chef slowly took me apart with a paring knife. All around me, the diners exchanged glances. Then, one began to slowly clap and others joined in. The girl who'd doused herself with soup reached forward and plucked the toe from her bowl, popping it whole into her mouth. She chewed and smiled as the rest of us watched her. Then, finally, after a few seconds, she spit out the nail. She continued chewing, working every last morsel off the bone. Finally, she spit that too into her hand and laid it back on the lettuce. It looked harmless enough now, a little white lump that might have belonged to a pig or a cow, but it hadn't. It had been attached to a person, maybe a few hours ago, maybe a few days, but recently. The rest of us looked down at our plates. Some people were giggling nervously, others cut at the toes with knives, trying to saw off small pieces of flesh. A few more popped the toes whole into their mouths. I felt bile welling up at the base of my throat. I looked over at Marcus. There was no toe on his plate. Where had it gone? Then I looked up and realized that his mouth was full. He was chewing something methodically, like gum. He smiled at me. "It's good," he said, a bit of drool escaping from the side of his mouth. "Like, really, really good." I looked down at the toe on my plate. If I didn't eat it, I didn't know what would happen to me. Maybe nothing, maybe drowning in black water. I took my fork and gently prodded the toe. Turning it in the light, I noticed a fleck or red nail polish clinging to the side. For a moment, I felt certain I'd vomit, but I was able to overcome the reflex. "Is everything okay?" asked a waiter, towering over me. "I assure you, the meat is cooked perfectly." It's just... I pointed to the fleck of nail polish. Should that be there?
Nah.
The waiter looked at the red polish, horrified. In an instant, he'd whisked my plate away, muttering apologies. I looked up and down the table. Half of the toes were gone now, the meat consumed, the bones littering the plates like soggy marshmallows. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to consider the possibility that I wouldn't have to eat one. Perhaps I would be spared, ushered along to dessert, my failure to cannibalize forgotten. And then the waiter returned, a fresh plate in hand. He laid it on the table in front of me. There stood the largest toe I'd seen in all my life. I imagined the man it must have come from, some kind of 7-foot giant, his basketball career now cut short. "Compliments of the chef," said the waiter, his smile a threat. It seemed impossible that I could consume such a thing. I doubted I could fit the whole thing in my mouth. Everyone else had finished their food by then and were watching me with eager anticipation. "People are watching," whispered Marcus, pointing out the obvious. "I want to go home," I said, quietly. I'm not sure anyone heard. I imagined myself an hour in the future, puking my guts out in my apartment's small, clean bathroom. I wanted so much to skip every moment of my life until then. "I never should have invited you here," said Marcus quietly. "Everyone said you were a prude. I thought I could change you, but here we are. You're a monster," I said quietly. "I'm an alpha," he said, "but sheep can't tell the difference."
Nah.
"My dish had nail polish on it," I said quietly. "It's ruined my evening." I looked meaningfully at the waiter. "Ruined?"
Nah.
The waiter recoiled slightly. It was the first time that evening I'd seen any of the staff on its heels. "I'm full," I said a little louder, and then, without another word, I picked up the toe and dropped it onto Marcus's plate. The waiter sneered, but he didn't shoot me, didn't stab me with a steak knife. "Congratulations, you've embarrassed me," said Marcus. "Great story for your grandkids."
Nah.
"At least I'm not eating fucking human flesh," I said. And then he started laughing and laughing. Others began to laugh too, whispering what I'd said to the other beside them. I remembered a birthday party I'd attended when I was younger, when I'd accidentally wet myself while playing on a bouncy castle. Everyone had noticed. They'd even created a horrible nickname that followed me to school. Eventually, I'd had to switch districts. "What's so fucking funny?" I asked Marcus. He dabbed at his eyes with his handkerchief, wiping away tears. "What do you think we've been eating all night?" he asked. Megan and I had been roommates since freshman year, both standing at 5'4" with long blonde hair and sharing nearly everything aside from Megan's general optimism. Most people mistook us for sisters right out of the gate. It was only a matter of time before we were doing everything together, even syncing our classes to the same schedule and declaring the same major. We weren't forcing the friendship. Everything just seemed to fall in line naturally for us. By our junior year, we had moved out of student housing and into a studio apartment near campus. We got jobs down the street, Megan at the coffee shop and me at the college bar. Different work shifts meant different class schedules, and we weren't able to see each other as often. We made Tuesdays our designated date night and would go out to some local dive bar or brewery to catch up on the week. About 4 weeks ago, I arrived at our normal dive and placed 2 pints, still sweating, onto the tacky outdoor table. After 10 minutes, I shot her a quick, "Where are you?" text and waited. Another 3 minutes later, my phone pinged. "See you soon. I've got someone I want you to meet."
Nah.
No sooner had I read the text when Megan showed up on the arm of an Adonis of a man. She didn't even look at me. Her face tilted up toward him like a lovesick puppy. He made eye contact with me and smiled, taking off a hat with letters I understood to mean he was in the Pi Kappa Alpha fraternity. "I'm Andy," he said, scooping me up into a quick embrace. "You must, Steph. I've heard a lot about you." I rolled my eyes internally, holding my tongue before letting him know I hadn't heard anything about him. "Nice meet you," I sighed. We met at the coffee shop. He stayed until after my shift was up. Told me my hair was as eye-catching as my smile, as if anyone would notice my smile when he's around. We haven't been apart since.
Ma.
My eyebrow arched. Oh, and how long ago was that?
Ma.
Andy shrugged good-naturedly. Sunday.
Ma.
The rest of the night was spent talking about Andy ad nauseum. While he tried to redirect the conversation to neutral ground, Megan decided nothing was worth saying if it wasn't glowing comments about Andy. In less than an hour, I decided I'd had enough. I've got to go. Between work and finals, I have next to no time to do anything else.
Ma.
Megan nodded absently, still staring at Andy while waving goodbye to me. He stood up and gave me another quick hug before I headed out. The next 2 weeks were a blur. I'd taken on extra shifts to help pay for next year's tuition and spent the rest of the time studying like a madwoman. Megan and I rarely saw one another during that time. We sometimes crossed paths at night, but she had little to say unless it was about her new guy. It was Sunday night, and I had my first final the following morning. I hadn't seen Megan in 3 days. I worked an earlier shift at the bar and got home around 10 p.m. to an empty studio. I shrugged out of my grimy bar clothes and into a pair of sweats before chugging a glass of water and hopping into bed. At some point in the night, I heard our door open. I glanced at my watch. 3:33 in the morning. I groaned. Megan, what are you doing? Is everything all right?
Ma.
She had her back to me. I wasn't sure what she was doing, but her long hair spilled out past her shoulders in the moonlight, and it sounded like she was packing something. Go back to sleep, she said. Everything is all right. Just go back to sleep. I suddenly couldn't keep my eyes open. My head was back on the pillow by 3:34. I woke up the next morning to birdsong. I stretched and tried remembering the events of that morning. I glanced over at Megan's bed, but she wasn't there. In fact, nothing was there. All of her stuff was gone, cleared out overnight. Alarmed, I jumped up and tried calling her phone, which immediately went to voicemail. I called friends, but no one had heard from her. I called Andy, but he said he hadn't seen her since yesterday. I tried her parents, who became alarmed once I explained she was gone, and so were her things. We tried the police, but were told we had to wait the typical 24 hours to report an adult who appeared to leave by choice. Even when we were able to file the report, it was clear we weren't being taken seriously. At this point, it seemed like my best friend had packed up and started a new life somewhere else, somewhere that didn't involve me. I spent the next couple of weeks moping around, completely skipping my finals and cancelling my shifts at work. Half of the time I was angry with Megan. We had been through so much for her to leave like that. Half of the time I was sad, lamenting the loss of someone who understood me so thoroughly. And sometimes I felt this inexplicable fear. This fear that even though I saw her pack her things and leave, she was somehow taken from me, taken from her family, against her will. I had taken to drinking by noon most days. I was a 21-year-old college student. I'd spent most of my time working and studying. I decided to live my best life and let loose for once. Plus, I didn't want to deal with the loss of my best friend, something sobriety forced me to face. On one of those days, I left the local dive and bumped into Andy. He gave me a sympathetic smile. Hanging in there. Steph.
Ma.
No, I slurred. No, I'm really not. What about you?
Ma.
He shrugged. I really liked Megan. She obviously didn't feel the same. No point in letting the fact that she left me ruin my life.
Ma.
I gave him one of those smiles that everyone knows actually means, hey, fuck you, buddy, and started to walk away. He grabbed me by the shoulder before I could pass, his thumb brushing against my hair. We're having a party at the frat tonight. You should come, friend to friend. You look like you could use a night out. I shrugged off his arm. Sure, I'll think about it. I walked off muttering that there was no way in hell I would be caught at some idiot's big dumb frat party. 8 hours later, I found myself stumbling into some idiot's big dumb frat party. I had done some soul searching and realized I was drunk. I was single. I was maybe ready to mingle, just a little, before running back home for some mint chip and Netflix. The party was exactly what you would expect. Lots of dudes screaming bro at each other, chugging beer. and snorting what suspiciously looked like cocaine off the school's more scantily dressed sorority sisters. I wandered through the house, waving at Andy, who gave me the 1-minute hand to let me know he wanted to talk. I suddenly decided it was all too much and started backing out the way I had come. But then something curious happened. A phone rang. A landline phone rang. Those old-fashioned landline phones with the rotary dial that you only see in your grandma's attic or old movies. In a drunken stupor, I decided to be the one to answer. An intentionally soft, effeminate voice spoke on the end of the line. It sounded like whoever was speaking was doing a caricature of what they thought a soft-spoken man would sound like. "This is John Carver. Is Andy there?" I put the phone down. Somehow, I knew the caller's name wasn't John Carver, just like I knew the voice he spoke with wasn't his. Before I had a chance to process this, I felt a presence creep up behind me. I turned around to find Andy just inches away from me. "What are you doing with that?"
Matt.
"Oh, yeah. Someone is on the phone for you. John Carter."
"What caliber?"
Something like that.
Matt.
His entire demeanor changed. His eyes flashed with fear, and the rise and fall of his chest told me his breath had quickened. He put his hands on my shoulders, thumbs digging in so deeply I knew there would be bruises in the morning. "I need you to tell me exactly what was said."
Matt.
I was suddenly very uncomfortable, not just with his touch, but with the seriousness of his question. I knew in that moment that whoever was on the phone was someone I didn't want anything to do with. I can't remember. I stuttered, fear preventing me from saying what I knew, but one look from him told me I needed to calm down and remember. "John Carver." He said it was John Carver, and he wanted to know if you were there. He was really quiet. I had to strain to hear him, and he didn't say a word to me. He immediately pulled out his phone and shut off the music screaming from the surround sound in the room. "Time to get the fuck out."
"Cops are on their way!" Matt.
Some people got up to leave. Others kind of milled about while figuring out what to do. It was then that the lights flickered and went out, bathing us in an eerie, half-moon light. The air abruptly changed, becoming thick with the sickly sweet smell of death. The silence became deafening, the world quiet, save for the screaming cry of tinnitus piercing through the otherwise noiseless veil. All at once, the other Pi Kappa Alpha brothers were galvanized into action. Several tried to usher their friends or girlfriends out. Others just stopped moving entirely. They pulled their shirts over their eyes and went to the ground in the fetal position. The people who were just visiting stifled nervous giggles. Others, the ones who lived there, were frozen in terror. I fell into the latter group. Despite being a visitor, I knew this wasn't a prank. It wasn't hazing. It was something real and dark and violent. The sound came back all at once, but it wasn't the sounds of the party or the street life beyond the home. It was the sound of something we had never heard but all knew. It was the sound of the monster underneath the bed, the sound of the dark when the flashlight runs out of batteries, the sound of the phone ringing to let you know a loved one was gone, taken in a violent manner. It was the sound of evil. I shut my eyes and remained frozen in place, having earlier decided to lie on the ground like the others. I felt the breeze of a door opening and knew something wicked was coming. Then the first one was in. It was like a shadow of a human, but larger and more oppressive. It walked in as if in a frenzy to get something done, the way my mother would walk in after work. She would rush in, drop her keys and purse in the bowl by the front door, and head into the kitchen to get dinner going before Dad got home. This thing moved the same way, invoked the same feelings. It felt benign as long as I stayed still and stayed quiet. I saw it moving in my periphery, heading to the table that held that night's delights. With a sweep of its dark hand, all the bouncy, drugs, and what little bit of food that was left was swept off the table. The door was thrown open a second time. It took every ounce of self-restraint I had to not react. An even larger figure than the first walked in. This one took its time, slow, tongue out, and eagerly tasting the horror that pervaded the room. A second, smaller and crueler creature followed closely behind. I could feel it spread out, trying to reach all of us at once. Somehow the collective room knew to stay quiet, knew not to move. We knew we needed to squeeze our eyes shut and pretend whatever was happening was just a bad dream. I was confident we all held the same belief when a small scream carried across the room. Whether she screamed out of fear or out of drunkenness, I'll never know. Faster than my brain could register, the two figures converged on a woman I had seen earlier in the night. She was one of those donning a bikini top and a coke necklace, confidently smiling at every man that crossed her path. She didn't deserve what happened. Her screams, quiet at first, quickly became desperate and painful. She begged for help. But this night wasn't one for bravery. None of us were going to save her. I watched as her body was stretched across the table, body bent in a shape no body should be able to make. Her hands and feet arched past what was humanly possible and tied in knots below the tabletop. Bones and tendons cracking like gunshots in the air as they were manipulated in a way I couldn't conceive of. Her blonde hair splayed out like a cruel crown around her head. She wore a mask of pain on her face. When I thought her agony was nearing the end, when I thought no human body could endure that suffering without going into shock and dying, something worse happened. They feasted. They sat at together like a family and consumed her alive. They made little smacking noises of pleasure, crunching and slurping while she continued screaming, playing together in unison like the world's most savage symphony. I heard something plop to the ground and roll close to my face. An eye was inches away from me, full of fear and still blinking rapidly. The smallest creature, giggling, slithered across the floor and lay its face next to mine. Slowly, I watched as an oil-slick tongue crawled across the floor to scoop up her still-moving eye, swallowing it whole. But it didn't leave after. The tongue made its way up to my face, pausing just short of touching me. It was gleeful. I knew in that moment that if I so much as breathed, my fate would be even worse than the poor woman on the table. I sensed disappointment before the thing got up and went back to join the others. And then it was over. They finished off their meal, a grotesque Norman Rockwell in the making, and left as quickly as they came. It felt like an eternity before anyone moved again. Andy started moving amongst everyone, hushed whispers to his brothers. I glanced over at the table, but nothing was left of what happened that night. Just the party favors sprinkling the floor. The others started getting up, not wanting to acknowledge the truth of the night. Some cried, silent hiccups rocking their bodies. Others walked out stonily, still numb and in shock from the nightmare we had all shared. We knew we would never acknowledge this night again. No one would believe it. But worse than that, we knew that if we acknowledged it, then we would make them real, make them an unavoidable part of our lives. So we all had to go home and pretend to sleep while the horror of that evening impacted all of our future decisions and hid in our nightmares. I joined in the others in the slow shuffle out the door, devoid of all feelings that weren't acute terror. I avoided making eye contact with anyone, eager to curl into my bed and cry until the sun came up. But as I was walking out, I heard something that gave me pause, something that made me realize Megan hadn't left me after all. In a whispered but frenzied voice, I overheard Andy say, "I don't understand. I just fed them 2 weeks ago." Not too long ago, I saw a viral video compilation of thieves in low-income areas, people filling up baskets with items and walking out the door, breaking windows, threatening cashiers, that kind of stuff. But one of the 3-second clips in the compilation was something different. In the clip, we can see a group of people walking over a broken glass door, slowly marching. It looks like a riot, but there's more to it. I was there, and I want to tell the whole story. This happened a few years ago. Before heading off to college, I wanted to save up some extra money. I used to live in a pretty shitty neighborhood, and there were only 2 options for a side gig. One was at the local bar, and the other was at a convenience store. I applied at the convenience store, had a quick interview with the manager, and started the following Monday. Now, I gotta stress just how run down this place was. This was the kind of place where the same homeless man sits outside every day, all day, where there were no baskets to carry stuff in. They'd been stolen too many times. There were a dozen signs taped to the door with a dozen little rules, all to prevent the various grifts and thefts that had been attempted over the years. No bags, no backpacks, No plastic bags, no canvas bags, no cots, and, of course, no weapons. Still, despite its faults, it was the only place local folks could afford to shop at. And while there were some people who took advantage of it, a vast majority loved the place, right down to the homeless guy chilling by the door. I was planning to be there for the summer. We had a morning and evening shift, and we changed who did what every 2 weeks. The video clip in question took place during my 4th week, my 2nd week at the evening shift. It was a Saturday evening. Benny, the homeless guy, was off to recycle some cans. The AC was acting up, leaving a thin layer of humidity on everything in the store, including me. I was working the counter. It was almost closing time, but I waited for Benny to get back before closing. The guy was harmless and survived on little to nothing. He usually spent what he'd earned during the day before closing time. I wasn't working alone. There was also Lani, a mother of 3 who wanted to get some extra money on the side while her husband was posted overseas. A woman in her mid-40s with this long black hair that could almost reach her knees. Every time I think of her, I'm reminded of oatmeal cookies. We were ready to close when a customer walked in. I was expecting Benny, so when I turned to see a complete stranger, I was a bit surprised. Now, we get new people all the time, but this one was unusual for a number of reasons. 1, he was clearly not a local. The guy was wearing a brand-name blazer and custom-tailored pants. 2, he was in a hurry. He was clutching this brown canvas bag, panting like a tired dog. I didn't get the time to ask him to hand it over, as per the sign. You got salt? He asked. Mineral salt.
Nah.
Yeah, go check. He was sprinting down the aisle before I had a chance to finish my sentence. Lani peeked out from the dairy aisle with a raised eyebrow. I shrugged. Moments later, there was some commotion. I went to check on the guy and saw that he'd pulled down 6 cans of salt on the floor, opened them, and drowned his bag in it. He was whining and pleading, repeating, "Come on, come on, come on," over and over. He was in distress, like his life depended on this. I didn't know what to do. I was going to call the police, but I wanted to de-escalate first. Still, I didn't want to talk to him. There was no telling what a guy in his state of mind might do. Instead, I stepped back, got my phone out, and talked to him as calmly as possible. "Sir, you can't do that in here," I said. "You need to pay and take this outside."
Nah.
There's no time," he said. I can't. I'm sorry."
Nah.
What happened next came out of nowhere. One moment, I was looking at this crazy guy covering the ground in salt. Next moment, pandemonium. Lani screamed at me from the front counter. The lights began to flicker, then die, leaving the store in sudden darkness. Running up to the front counter, my jaw dropped. Lani had barely managed to close and lock the front door. There were at least 24 people outside, none of whom I recognized. These people were something else entirely. At first glance, there was nothing strange about them, but looking a little closer, you could see a few things were off. For example, there was a woman in a nightgown. She didn't even have shoes on. A little further back, there was a guy who looked like a political campaigner for a candidate I'd never heard of. And to the side was this really tall man who looked like a fancy sommelier, except the front of his shirt had been cut to shreds, like he'd been run over by a lawnmower. These people were gathering around the storefront, poking and prodding for a way in. One of them smacked their hand flat on the glass. Lani was already calling the police. The store had security cameras once, but they had long since been wrecked. We just had these camera-looking things that were basically just a red light. It was mostly a deterrent rather than something functional, so there was no way for me to check how many people were really out there. Still, there were more than a few. I didn't even know that one of the front cameras actually worked, providing the clip in question later on. The strange man with the canvas bag was on his knees, crying, like full-on wailing like a scared kid. It was eerie to see someone just break down like that. It's at that point you start to realize how serious something really is. We had managed to lock ourselves in. Lani was on the phone, trying to get the police to hurry. It wasn't easy to get them to come by this neighborhood. Apparently, it was viewed as a bit of a lost cause. They advised her to get out of there and let our insurance company deal with it. The fact that these people showed up out of nowhere didn't seem to bother them, and the fact that our lives were in danger was described as exaggerating. I have this one vivid memory of the beginning of that night. There was this neon sign for a bar across the road, and that was the only light that came through. All these strange people, backlit by this eerie red and blue. It was eerie. There was no way to tell what was going to happen next. Were they there for us? For the store? For the strange man? While Lani kept calling for help, I turned my attention to the stranger. He'd slumped down against one of the shelves and gone catatonic. He just sat there, staring at the bag. I pushed against his shoulder a bit, and he didn't seem to notice. I decided to check the bag. This, too, garnered no response. The bag contained a sort of metal thermos, a silvery grey container that had burst open. There was a navy blue liquid covering the inside of the bag, now drenched in salt. It had this faint smell of ammonia and had begun to harden into a gel. I did my best not to touch it. "It's too late," the man whispered. "It's too late. It doesn't matter anymore." "What?" I yelled. "What doesn't matter?" "Who are you?" He waved his head back and forth, as if bobbing for an answer, but no words came to mind. He shook his head and sunk his face back into his hands. I tried to push him to answer, but he was just broken. There was no point in talking to him, and judging by the sounds coming from our storage, I didn't have time to stand around. I could hear Lani yelling at an emergency responder. I could hear a repeated metal clanking out back, like someone was beating the back door with a steel pipe. Then, a grinding metal noise. It took me a moment to realize that they were moving the trash container out back, probably to get up on the roof. I rushed back to Lani, who was hanging up the phone and trying again, desperate to get someone on the line who was ready to actually listen. "I think they're on the roof," I stuttered. "I think they're climbing." "Shit," she sniffled. "Shit, shit, shit." She took me by the arm and led me to the back storage. There, she pointed to a frail metal ladder leading to a yellow hatch in the ceiling, about 12 feet up. "Make sure it's locked. Block it with something." "With what?" "I don't know." She stormed back out a second later. I grabbed a metal pipe from a vacuum cleaner and painstakingly made my way up the ladder. I managed to lock the hatch and jam the pipe between two handles. It wasn't very stable, but it would hold for a bit. It was probably some kind of rooftop maintenance hatch, most likely for ventilation purposes. The thing hadn't been opened in years. The rust on the metal rungs testified to that. As I was about to climb back down, I stopped. I looked back up. While the hatch was shut, I could tell there was something up there. There was this low huffing noise coming from it. Someone was pressing their face against the other side of the hatch, breathing against it. Out of some morbid curiosity, I crept a little closer. "What do you want?" I spat. "What the hell do you want?" "Home," something mumbled. "Go home." It was such an eerie noise, like someone belching the words rather than speaking them, like an involuntary, painful reaction, more seizure than speech. "Home. Go home." Then, a crash. I hurried down the ladder, rushing towards the front door. This was the scene shown in the clip, a few seconds that we got from the only security camera that intermittently worked. They had broken through the door and were slowly stepping inside. They didn't seem to be in a hurry. If anything, they seemed exhausted. For a second, Lani and I just held our breaths. There was no way to tell what was going to happen. Finally, a man with a crowbar stepped forward. He looked at us and belched up something dark that covered his chest. Then, as if nothing happened, he walked right past us. The others followed. They were heading for the aisle with the strange man and the canvas bag. Lani had given up on calling for help. and had resorted to filming instead. It was helpless, but the only thing we could do. We couldn't fight these people. We were outnumbered 10 to 1. I considered pushing past them and just running into the night, but I didn't want to go near them. There was no telling what would happen if you provoked them. These weren't ordinary people. I can't tell you what was wrong, but I can tell you something was. What happened next? You can't see in the clip. 24 people descended on that aisle, picking up that canvas bag and tearing it apart. They were rubbing the contents of the broken thermos thing over themselves, climbing over one another to get every little drop of it. It looked like a goddamn snake pit of arms, heads and legs, people just devolving into careless meat, completely devoid of conscious thought. Animals. Meanwhile, the strange man was just sitting there, catatonic. As the bag was torn to pieces, a handful of the intruders sort of flopped over. They lay flat on their back, letting their legs and feet curl into something resembling dead branches. Others were making these excruciating, hungry, whining noises, desperately weeping at the empty bag. Then they turned their attention to the stranger. One of them clawed at his leg. He shook them off. Then another did the same. "No," he said. "No, no." It was this weak little grunt, like the man was fighting himself to realize what was about to happen. Lani and I shared a terrified look. "The fire extinguisher," Lani whispered. "Get the fire extinguisher."
Ma.
It was across the store. As soon as I turned my back on them, I heard the strange man's groaning no grow more desperate. It went from a mumble to an angry yell, to a desperate plea. Then it was just screaming, blood-curdling screaming, gaining and losing in strength. I got the fire extinguisher and ran back towards the aisle, meeting Lani halfway. She had this haunted look on her face and shook her head. She couldn't close her mouth, like her face was stuck in a panicked, silent scream. She covered her mouth with her hands, shaking like dry leaves. "Oh my God," she huffed. "Oh my fucking God."
Ma.
I didn't see much. There was blood, but like thick blood, chunks of it, tufts of hair, pieces of a torn shirt, bone. A couple intruders were rolling around the bloodied floor like it was catnip. Others were slowly getting up, disillusioned and desperate. One older man, covered mouth to toe in dripping blood, pointed a shaking finger at me and Lani. "Them," he coughed. Maybe them."
Ma.
Then they came for us. I didn't realize what was about to happen until they smiled. They clung to this primal hope that we, somehow, had something they needed. Lani snapped me out of it, dragging me into the back storage. She fumbled the keys and locked the double doors while I used a broom handle to bar them. There were still banging metal noises coming from both the ceiling hatch and the back door. Then, a voice. "Them," it wheezed. "Them, them, them."
Ma.
And from the back door, another voice parroted it. Like a rising storm, the words swept over the invaders, until we heard it everywhere. "Them, them, them." We made our way to the lunchroom before I heard the broom handle crack. They were through the storage doors. Lani was desperately dialing her phone while I locked us in the lunchroom, a tiny room with a shared bathroom, a window, and a couple of lockers. I could hear wet skin slap against the window, but I couldn't see what it was. The curtains were drawn. "Fucking yes," Lani cried into her phone. "Yes, yes. It's me again. They're getting in. They're..." The window broke. Before I even saw someone, I pulled the safety pin from the extinguisher and blasted whatever was trying to get in. Lani fled into the bathroom, locking it behind her. The next few seconds felt like an eternity. Someone was crawling through the broken glass of the window. I could see the rough stains of blood against the powdered white. The lunchroom door buckled. I could hear flesh hit concrete as the hatch in the storage broke outside. Someone fell through. It sounded like a hard boot coming down on a wet cabbage. They were breaking through, slowly but surely, all to the sound of a rhythmic them, them, them. I swung a locker open, but realized there was no way I could hide in there. I couldn't go for the window. I couldn't push past the doors. This was it. It was it. To this day, I lay awake thinking about what I felt in that moment. That ice-cold primal panic. Forgetting to breathe. Feeling your tongue drying up as your airways open up. Preparing for a death scream. Then, Lani pulled me into the bathroom. It was tiny. It was meant for, at best, one average-sized person. I fell backwards, landing with my back against the toilet. Lani climbed over me to lock the door just as someone reached the handle. The door opened inwards, so I put up my legs and locked my knees. Lani fumbled around in the sink, where she'd put her phone. Someone was still on the line, but I suspect all they could hear was our desperate screams and that ever-present mantra of them. 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 The hinges were shaking. The metal handle rattled. I could count every nail on the door and see the minuscule movements as they slowly rolled out. In that moment, all I could hear was my own heartbeat and how it slowly synced up to the monotonous chant of them. 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 Looking back at it, my mind is just black. There's nothing there. It's like trying to remember a vague nightmare, something that happened to an unreal version of yourself. And in those moments when you realize that you were there, the real you, then it spirals. And for a couple of skipped heartbeats, I'm back there, fighting for my life. I'm back with that chant, that banging on the door. At one point, the door buckled. Fingers poked through the gap, grabbing Lani's long black hair. They tore out a handful of it, like a full fist. Even in all that panic, I saw her scalp turning red, but we pushed back, and the door stayed shut just a little longer. It was still dark, but with every push against the door, and with every inch the door gave, little glimpses of moonlight came through like a sickening strobe light. But a little longer was all we needed. The final thing I heard them say was no. Home. Please. Home. Then this combination of home, them, please, and no. The banging slowly stopped. My hearing went from that awful mantra to my own heartbeat, and then nothing. A light breeze, perhaps. A careful knock. Lani and I held our breaths. Excuse me, you're doing all right in there?
Nah.
Benny, the homeless guy. The coast was clear. Stepping out, there was no one but Benny left. The ground was covered in this black ash, stinking of ammonia and sulfur, but the attackers were gone. The place was a complete mess. Every window and door broken. You could see traces in the ash where people had dragged their feet before they, seemingly, disappeared. Going back out into the store, there was no sign of the strange man. There was still blood spatter covering the side of the aisle, but now the ground was covered in that awful black ash. I stepped over the broken front door, past the trampled flowers and broken glass. I have this vivid memory of blue petals from a sunflower getting stuck to the side of my black work shoes as I went out into the night. Minutes later, the police showed up, and the rest is history. The whole event was categorized as a sort of riot. No suspect was arrested, and the strange man was never identified. From what I've heard, they never investigated anything as a murder or assault. For all intents and purposes, that night was just a strange break-in. So yeah, somehow, that clip made its way into a random compilation online. I'm not sure how. Lani sent me the link. It's been a few years, but we still keep in touch. Not a lot, though. Seeing one another kind of reminds us about that night, and I think both of us just wants to forget. I guess what I want to say is that some things are different from what they seem, so think twice before you share something. Take a step back, think, and really look. I doubt anyone reading this will be old enough to remember when two boys from Winstead went missing in the Welsh mountains. Their story of being found 2 weeks after a motorbike accident where Willie lost his leg briefly became national news and made my grandfather, Arthur Trevelyan, and his best friend, one-legged William Chambers, local celebrities. After the media attention faded away, they lived a normal life in the village. They were both regulars in their local pub. If one came to the bar, the barmaid would pour 2 pints, because they knew the other was soon to follow. It became tradition at the strike of midnight every New Year for Willie to take off his prosthetic leg. Arthur would fill the socket with beer, and both drank to their health. Both started businesses, married, had kids, divorced, then lived alone. Arthur recently passed away, just a month after William's death. Both suffered heart attacks. I suppose that was just another thing they did together. They say you shouldn't speak ill of the dead, and I don't intend to, but I believe the truth needs to be told. So I want to tell you the true story of what happened when Willie lost his leg. Back in 1972, William and Arthur were taken on a summer trip with Winstead Youth Club from the flat fenlands of eastern England to the Brecon Beacons in Wales. The landscape couldn't be much more different from their homeland, with steep green valleys, roaring waterfalls, and rugged grey mountains. They were put up in a hostel amongst the mountains, and the boys loved it. They were both 18 and yearning for freedom and adventure. In Willie's own words, the two were a pair of little shits who got up to all sorts of trouble. Then one day they excelled themselves. After a morning of hiking and raft making, they returned to their lodgings for the afternoon. Both William and Arthur were interested in cars, but William was particularly interested in motorbikes. He had one back home, a heavily dented and rust-covered mongrel of a 50cc dirt bike he cobbled together from discarded parts. He used to love taking it out across the fields and making his escape when they got inevitably chased off by the farmers. Arthur would often ride pillion. Willie was delighted when he saw a brand new 175cc Honda Scrambler in a beautiful royal blue parked up outside the hostel office. Arthur recalled that he became obsessed with the thing. Willie described it as all the way from Japan, as if it was a starship from another planet. When night came, William decided to act upon his obsession. He conspired with Arthur to sneak out while everyone else slept and pinch the Honda's keys out of a jacket left hanging in the office. Arthur got the key and they wheeled the bike away from the activity center in silence. Once hidden behind the curve of the valley, they dared to start the engine. Willie Saturday as pilot and Arthur jumped on the back. Then they sped off in a puff of exhaust smoke. They flew down random roads, the yellow headlight dimly guiding their way amongst the sudden twists and turns, turning upwards into the dark mountains and eventually leaving the tarmac road and heading onto gravel tracks. On one sweeping right-hand bend, the front wheel lost grip and slid out, sending the motorcycle slapping to the ground with a metallic crunch. The bike went ahead, grinding along the gravel, its headlight and tail light swirling in a brief chaotic dance, until it disappeared over the edge of the road. Willie and Arthur slid along behind it, but summer clothes and skin don't last long when moving fast across gravel. They both left blood on the road, like red crayons on sandpaper, while momentum dragged them after the motorbike and down the mountainside into darkness. This is where the accounts differ, not between Arthur and Willie, but between what Arthur said then and what he recently confessed. After Willie's funeral, Arthur started to suffer from manic episodes in the night. I thought it was just bad dreams triggered by his grief, maybe early Alzheimer's or dementia. I'm no expert on the medical side, and we never had time to get him assessed, given the state of NHS waiting lists, but Arthur insisted this wasn't just in his mind. Arthur told me that at night he saw his old friend as an 18-year-old, hopping through his bedroom door in his tattered and bloody clothing, scared, confused, and crying out, "Where is my leg?" Willie held onto the doorframe for stability, leaving red smears on the white paint. Night after night he would visit. Day after day, Arthur would obsessively wipe the doorframe clean. The story Arthur told at the time was that after the crash, he eventually awoke battered and bruised. But Willie remained unconscious and much more badly injured. In the process of the crash and the tumble down the cliffside, Willie's leg had been broken, twisted, ripped off below the knee, then lost to the mountain. Arthur made a tourniquet from his belt, and despite the cold Welsh summer, he sacrificed his own clothes to staunch the bleeding from Willie's stump. Arthur tended to his friend as best he could, regardless of his own injuries. He collected water from a nearby stream and fed it to Willie from his cupped hands whenever conscious. After a week, both started to get desperately hungry. Willie was worryingly weak, and Arthur managed to catch and strangle a couple of rabbits by hand, which had to be cut with a sharpened stone and eaten raw. Willie could only stomach small slithers of the bloody meat before passing out again. During daylight, Arthur searched the valley but couldn't find any way back to the road. After what felt like countless days, he found the motorcycle's blue petrol tank on the mountainside, with a few drops of fuel left in it. He shook it out over some kindling and eventually managed to spark a flame by hitting pieces of metalwork together for a spark. On the fire, Arthur cooked some rabbit strips skewered on the end of a stick and ate as much as he could. Willie was awoken by the cooking meat and managed to eat a few bites while conscious. Later that day, the smoke from the fire was spotted and rescuers found them. Willie was found just in time to save his life and his survival. After 2 weeks injured in the wild saw, Arthur declared a hero in the papers. Willie spent months in hospital before settling back into their normal lives at home in Winstead. They confessed to the theft of the bike, but escaped prosecution as it wasn't in the public interest. Arthur became a carpenter. Willie became a mechanic. Nothing ever put him off motorbikes. They remained lifelong friends. When Willie died of a heart attack last month, it hit the whole town hard. He was a tearaway kid, but he was a kind, funny, carefree man. He always felt he owed a debt of gratitude to my grandfather, and by extension, toward me and the rest of my family. He gave me a job in his garage when I finished school. I helped out as much as I could, and he paid me far more than I deserved. He even kept paying me a salary while I was off at university so I could focus on studying. Grandad Arthur started to take his turn for the worse straight after the funeral. I came back from uni for the funeral and stayed in his spare room to keep him company. He was retired but still in good health and was endlessly working on renovation projects around the house, which I tried to help with. Every day we would work on his projects, watch whatever football or bad TV show was on, then go to bed. At night he would wake up, sometimes so terrified he would be shouting frantically. The first night I heard him shout, "I thought we were being burgled," and I ran into his room brandishing a hammer I grabbed from Arthur's toolbox. But there was nothing there. Grandad began to look sad and weak, like I had never seen him like that before. He was always strong and quick to laugh, even about the accident. When my mum cooked him dinner, he would say, "Better than raw rabbit," as a backhanded compliment. He became so quiet. These terrors happened every night for weeks. I didn't always hear him wake, but I always saw him cleaning up the next morning. He eventually told me Willie was haunting him in the night. More than once I asked him why. They were such close friends until the end. He didn't answer. I once read a book that suggested ghosts exist as unanswered questions. So Arthur needed to try to answer the question and put the ghost to rest. I didn't believe in ghosts, but maybe this would exorcise the spectre within his own mind. Then on his last morning I went in and checked on Arthur. He was exhausted from scrubbing his doorframe clean after another sleepless night. The paint was wearing off, exposing the bare wood beneath. He had developed dark bags under his eyes. He stopped cleaning, Saturday on the end of his bed and started sobbing. "Sorry," Arthur said softly through his tears. "I'm sorry, Willie. I'd never seen him like this. Just completely broken." I Saturday with him until he calmed down. Then Arthur said he had something he needed to confess. I felt like he wasn't just confessing to me. Everything I said before about the crash was true, he told me, except for the rabbits. I was confused at first. I couldn't think why he would lie about that, but he continued. "You have to remember, it was weeks. We had nothing to eat. We were cold and injured. We were both dying. But Willie was going to die first if I didn't do something. I searched. I tried hunting. The rabbits ran as soon as they saw me, and I was too weak to chase them. The stream was shallow and it had no fish. There were no berries. There was nothing. Then I found it in the stream, kept cold and fresh." He stopped and took a deep breath, like he was just about to go underwater. "What did you find?" I asked. He looked up at me, then down at the floor in shame. His leg. He looked up at me, then down at the floor in shame. His leg. That night there was no shouting. The next morning there was no cleaning. I went to Arthur's room to check on him and found him still in his bed. Heart attack, according to the coroner. Maybe he was simply haunted to death by a friend he ate part of, and fed part of themselves too, but I choose to believe that Willie came one last time. An older, understanding Willie. Arthur answered his question and decided to go with him. If Arthur had let them both starve in that valley, they may never have escaped. They may not have had the chance to see their children or grandchildren grow up. Judge him if you will. It was a grim choice, but it was a choice that needed to be made, and Arthur was the only one who could make it. Arthur and Willie would probably joke about it over a pint if they could. They loved each other. Not that men of their generation could easily admit it. They would have done anything for each other. Arthur did what he had to do. The morning I found him dead, there was blood on the door frame. It wasn't Arthur's. It was all true except for the rabbits. Thank you for venturing into the darkness with us. If you dare to explore further, be sure to subscribe to our channel for more spine-tingling tales of horror and the supernatural. Remember, the shadows hold endless mysteries, waiting to be unveiled. Stay tuned for more bone-chilling stories as we continue to traverse the eerie depths of the unknown together. Until next time, may your dreams be free from the haunting echoes of our tales. Or perhaps not.